All right. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order the August 17th, 2017 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission. At this time, I'd like to ask everyone to silence electronic devices. If you've got a laptop you're working on or a cell phone, just please put it on silent. And Heather, would you please call the roll?
Iris Marty Gibson. Here. Mike Estes.
Here.
Lisa Anderson.
Here.
Steve Crooks.
Here.
Holly Taishi.
Here.
Garrett and Phyllis have been excused.
Thank you. So we're going to go through a couple housekeeping items before we get started, but I know there's some people who might be new to Planning Commission meetings, so I just want to lay out kind of the structure of the meeting because it's a relatively unique situation to have us all down here at the lower level. Normally we're sitting up here. But for work sessions, we've been doing this lately, and it's worked pretty good because it's more of a dialogue approach. A work session is not a public hearing. It's just an opportunity for a topic to be introduced or discussed. And so it is more of a dialogue with staff, and this format kind of facilitates that. And so we'll be having a work session tonight on short-term rentals. But before we do that, we're going to go through a few housekeeping items. We don't have any minutes to approve, so we won't have any minutes review. But we will have a public comment period in a moment, which is for people to talk about anything other than short-term rentals. So if you're here to talk about that, don't get up. If you want to talk about anything else, that's your chance. And then we'll move into the work session after that. We'll have a presentation from staff. We'll have questions and discussion. Again, this is just an opportunity to introduce the topic. Not going to make any decisions or recommendations tonight, just to kind of get ideas out there. And if planning commissioners have additional feedback they need from staff, now's a good time to ask that. Planning director is here. He's indicated to, I'm sure they'll do introductions in a minute, but he's indicated that we'll probably have another work session before we even move anywhere into a public hearing. So this is just the very beginning of what will be a multi-meeting conversation. And then at the end of that, we'll take public testimony. So during work sessions, we take the public testimony at the very end. So if you do want to comment on short-term rentals, when we're done with our discussion, we'll give you an opportunity to come up to the microphone and share your thoughts for a period of 3 minutes or something like that. And with that, I think we should just move into the regular public comment period. So if anybody wants to talk about anything other than short-term rentals, now's your chance. Come on down to the mic, share your name and address, and your thoughts with us. Anybody? Okay. Seeing nobody, we will close the public comment period and move into our work session, which again is a discussion on short-term rentals. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Lisa and Rick to introduce the topic. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stay here because I think it's easier than having my back to the audience, at least on this one. Good evening, members of the Planning Commission. I'm Rick Sepler. I'm the Planning and Community Development Director. I'm joined by Senior Planner Lisa Poole. Tonight is an opportunity for us in a relatively informal setting to give you some background materials associated with an issue that's emergent. If we talked 10 years ago about Airbnb and short-term rentals and renting things online, I think we'd get a lot of quizzical looks. It was in its infancy, and as you saw for some of the materials we provided, the numbers have grown almost exponentially. In Bellingham, it is an emerging issue in the sense that in terms of enforcement, we haven't had a significant number of requests. And looking at the number of listings on one of the more popular carriers, Airbnb, there's about 300 and some odd, but there's no certainty on their exact location. That contrasts with areas that are more heavily developed towards this type of accommodation. New York City or other areas have in the multiples of thousands of units that are available. They are representative of a change in both the economy and the nature of people desiring experiences as they travel. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about definitions and make sure we have the same terms, what we're talking about, and talking of what this specific aspect of code review would look to. We look at our local status, how have we been regulating them to date, and what are the things we've encountered so far. Lights off? Okay. I like to keep you partially in the dark. We'll talk about other municipalities. As you might recall, when we discussed this as an emerging issue last spring, we talked about some very pivotal things that were happening at other jurisdictions. There was until December of this past year and February of this year active lawsuits involved with the regulation and information associated with Airbnbs. That was pretty important for us because up until that point, many of the carriers, the folks who were the websites that advertised the rental units, contended they were nothing more than a website and were not required to provide information on who was using their website and the number of times they were rented. So both sides fought, settlements have occurred, and jurisdictions across the nation have developed ordinances to regulate it. Bellingham, again, smaller, benefits from others who've had a chance to look at this. And the key before us today really is to say, what's the best suite of regulations to address this use in our city? And I don't believe there's one magic bullet that will work for every city. Each one's different. They value different things. They have different motivations and needs. However, I don't think it's a need to reinvent the wheel in the sense that we have all of the approaches that are used in a number of jurisdictions, and we can actually talk about their effectiveness and they've accomplished our ends. So while we will brush on those tonight, I think it is somewhat like checking boxes on different approaches, and then perhaps there's a new approach, one or two, that we hadn't considered that might be best for us, and we'll figure out the right mix that goes. Additionally, we're a fairly large city spatially, and I would probably suggest that one set of rules may not cover all of the unique issues we have in Bellingham. So what are short-term rentals? Typically, there are two things we see in terms of uses. We have short-term uses, which are considered transient uses. They're typically 29 days or less, and more than 29 days are considered residential uses. So typically, when you look at regulating short-term rentals, you're looking for anything that's up to 29 days. Most codes nationwide consider 30 plus on to be a residential use. You could rent month by month, allowed typically where residential is. Less than that typically is considered transient. And in the older approach, we're only allowed in transient facilities. Many of those were hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts, tourist homes, all those permutations with different regulations that went with them. A significant change on this has been the sharing economy, and the sharing economy is based on the fact that the web has become an integral part of our lives, and it provides us a way of accessing data and providing feedback. It's interesting to note in conversations in preparing for this, just having the web to list the uses isn't really the driver. It's also the fact that there's a number of reviews that are provided for each of the sites. One of the things that made hotel chains strong nationwide was consistency. You could go to a Ramada Inn in Cody, Wyoming, or a Ramada Inn in California, and they were Ramada Inns, and you kind of knew what you were getting. That provided sort of assurance. A challenge prior to the web was if you're renting out it, is this a good place? Will it work for me? Is it a good accommodation? Because of the self-reviews by the folks who stay there, there's a greater confidence interval that you're going to a place that's really going to work for you. And I think this is one of the biggest changes we've seen in the past 20 years in terms of accommodations. Typically, they were typically zoned to be in commercial uses. They had proximity to certain landmarks and features. There was a significant push in traditional zoning to keep accommodations out of residential areas because of traffic and noise and density and a number of other issues. But also it was because most scale of the units that were done were probably incompatible at the time. So we just mentioned the growth. I think you could see it's almost exponential in terms of one company, one provider, Airbnb. And you might ask, why are we using Airbnb? Well, by a third party, we're able to get all of Airbnb's data in terms of its total rentals. And we don't have that for the 22 other listing groups or agencies or companies that are online. So we'll use this as being fairly indicative. They are the most familiar. They're certainly not the only one. And I should note that Airbnb is used by conventional, traditional brick and mortar hotels, motels, and other facilities at this point in time, because it's a great vehicle to get the message out. So just regulating Airbnb may not get to the heart of really what you're talking about. In terms of overall guests, we've gotten up to the point where there's almost 15 million people as of this summer, probably more, who've stayed at home. There are some notions here to talk about too. There are all sorts of permutations. I just mentioned that you can get a traditional hotel room through Airbnb. You can get a room in a house where other folks are living through Airbnb, and you can get everything in between, multiple rooms to a whole house. There's actually a website and booking agency that's targeting rent the whole house, that you wouldn't have to share it. The sharing economy, I guess, only goes so far in certain places. So in looking at the opportunities for it, and we're going to talk largely about in residential areas using typical residential uses, single-family, multifamily units, things like that. There are benefits for operators in the community. They provide supplemental income. The tagline for much of Airbnb's advertising as of late has been helping the middle class to make ends meet. They provide a much more affordable lodging option than many conventional hotels. They provide tourism with an experience of being more connected to the day-to-day life of the community you're staying in. And clearly, when uses come up, there's often the counterpoint. Many folks have expressed concern about housing stock that's taken out for housing and now used for accommodations. Folks are concerned about neighborhood character. That character typically is associated with knowing your neighbors and understanding who lives in the community and the investment they have. And the concern might be that guests who are there for 1 or 2 nights really aren't invested. You don't know who they are. It's a new car every evening. So it's a disequilibrium to some extent. Guest behavior, noise and parking. A lot of the regulatory approaches that are out there are really focused on addressing the sort of the causality of a place and preventing the adverse use. If you could regulate noise and parking, if there was no visible evidence of it, it really is not different in terms of impacts. Health and safety, again, many of the units in some jurisdictions are not legally established, nor inspected, nor safe. So you want to make sure that they have a minimum standard to be met. And finally, tax evasion is a pretty serious crime, and we have hoteliers who and many operators of B&Bs and Airbnb type uses, short-term rentals, who diligently pay their taxes. Some do not. And essentially, those taxes, including lodging tax, are used to help market the area. They help track the visitors who are now occupying the places, and it's somewhat unfair if you don't get everyone to pay their fair share of those. So looking at it right now, again, through that third-party site, we show 345 Airbnb listings. We note there are about 33 hosts with more than one listing, so they have multiple properties. I should note Airbnb, if folks have tried it, it's not precise on the address until you actually go for it. Decide, press that button, yes. And many of our Airbnbs might not even be in Bellingham proper. That's not uncommon. Bellingham is the location folks are looking for. They might find out they're out on Lake Whatcom or out in the county or some other area, Chuckanut or others. So it's an estimate. Short-term rental or vacation rental is not defined in the code. There is state law that talks about transient and residential, and that's at 29 days we talked about before. We do allow bed and breakfast facilities. Those are subject to conditional use permits. Bed and breakfasts were a trend where rooms were rented. They were required to have an ownership presence on the site. You would get a conditional use, and as you recall, conditional uses are not outright denied nor outright permitted. They're considered on a case-by-case basis, and could be operated. B&Bs were a significant trend, I'd say 20 years ago, and they were a model that existed. We still have some that are actively being operated, but in many ways the ability to use the online listings and the services sort of are a different way of doing it. Much of the uses could be considered similar, and we've considered it so. I'd like to take a moment now to introduce Lisa, and she's going to talk a little bit about how other jurisdictions work. She'll talk about the regulatory context too.
Thank you.
Good evening, Lisa Poole, Senior Planner. So we did look at quite a few other cities and counties and how they regulate short-term rentals or vacation rentals. There are lots of different terminology for it. And what we found is there's kind of different groupings. There's some that are sort of on the low regulation side, and they just are regulating the minimum with a license or an application, collecting taxes and life safety regulations. And then there are others that are on the higher regulation side, and they look at limitation on location or even to the block. You know, you could only have like one within a certain block or an area, and notifying neighbors and posting rules and contact information at the site, and special parking regulations. And then, of course, what's not listed is some communities have decided not to allow them at all. So there are, in your packet, I've talked about 4 particular cities, Bend, Oregon, Boulder, Colorado, Tacoma, and Missoula, Montana. So I'll just briefly give you an overview of what these cities are looking at. And Bend is a city of about 90,000 folks on the Deschutes River. According to AirDNA, which is the website that collects Airbnb data and that's easily accessible, they have about 2,254 listings. They require an operating license with fees, and if the property is sold or ownership changes, they have to get a new license. It's not transferable. They have 2 application types. They have a Type 1 application, which is for units less than 30 days. The Type 2 application is if it's more than 30 days rented more than 30 days in a year, and more than 2 bedrooms with the owner present. You can use both the main house and an accessory dwelling unit as a short-term rental, and then they have a whole host of standards related to parking, contact information, notification, occupancy, and safety. Boulder, Colorado is a university town of about 108,000 at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in northern Colorado. They require a short-term rental license with a fee. The rental property must be the owner's principal residence, and that means where a person resides for more than half the year. The owner may only have an STR license for either the main unit or the accessory unit, not both. And they also have standards related to contact information, occupancy, and safety. Tacoma, Washington is on the banks of the Puget Sound, south of Seattle. And it requires a business license and a transient accommodation license if renting 3 or more individual rooms, and both require fees. The owner must reside in the home if renting individual rooms or a separate accessory dwelling unit. If renting the whole home, the owner isn't required to be on the site. Certain types of rentals are allowed in certain districts, and they also have standards related to safety and occupancy. And in talking to MRSC, which is the Municipal Research Service Center, I believe that's, is that right? Okay. They do a lot of research for cities, and I just contacted them to ask them if they had collected some of this information. And they said that Tacoma and Seattle are considered to be a little more on the lenient side regarding short-term rentals. Missoula, Montana. It's the county seat of Missoula County. It's located along the Clark Fork River, and it's home to the University of Montana. They require registration and an annual renewal, both with fees. It's permitted only in certain districts, so not all districts. They have a limitation on the number of units per building and the number of homes in residential districts that are allowed to be rented. And they also have standards related to contact information, notification, safety and signs. And then there are a whole host of other cities that we looked at. Whatcom County is currently drafting regulations, and they're looking at allowing short-term rentals as accessory in most zones. And they have a whole host of standards related to occupancy and signage and et cetera. And then Seattle, once again, is considered a little more lenient. They require proof that the unit is an owner's primary or secondary residence. A license number has to be included on any listing on any of the websites where they're posting the site. A local contact number is required, a signed declaration that the unit is up to code, and safety information posted for its guests. Port Townsend, Washington is one community that does not allow short-term rentals at all. And then in your packet, you'll notice that we looked at other communities in other states like Durango, Colorado. They have one of the strictest codes that we've seen, considered a high regulation community. So with that, I think we're ready to walk through the approaches. And I do have that.
So I was going to encourage the Planning Commission to visit all of those cities and perhaps stay in an Airbnb and see if it's worthwhile, because certainly the great photography. Okay, so now we talk about how do we get our arms around what the right approach would be. At this time, it's important to sort of have that discussion about what the benefits and the challenges would be, and then figure out if there's a singular approach or multiple approaches that might work based on certain criterions. In looking at that, based on a review of other jurisdictions, the bookends are from not allowed, Port Townsend is a good example of that, to conditional use permit. And remember, conditional use permit means a case-by-case review of it. When we put green on here, we're looking at our first blush of things we'd want to explore, meaning we'd want to start with sort of a core that would allow through application licensing with fees. Once you make the decision that you are going to proceed, because clearly we could have that discussion, and after consideration you might say we're just not going to allow it. There's no need to find regulatory methods to control or direct it. Should you choose to proceed in either the one of no regulation or higher regulation, we'd like to consider these different uses. The first is many cities have adopted a total number citywide. The point on that is to try to limit the impacts. I believe Bend, Oregon has a limitation of 274. I think it's 248 or 274. And I always wondered where that number came from. Perhaps it's biblical, but the truth of the matter is they had 248 or 274 units when they started regulating. And their approach was to say, we're going to have a limit on the number. There should be no more than we have now. What we have now is just fine. And they have a very complex system that if a use is extinguished, it's not transferable. It actually goes into a lottery for folks who can just see if they can get the permit to continue it and keep that number going. Challenges with this approach are it's hard to ascertain what the right number would be, and it would be difficult to see in a city that's 29 square miles how that would be affected, because all of them could be built next to each other. So that typically follows with the dispersion requirement. Many cities have thought that rather than seeing a whole street that's at, this is a California and Oregon coast issue, where streets that fronted on the beach, eventually all of the homes turn to rental. And when you're the last holdout there on overnight rentals and you're trying to live, it was a little more difficult, so it changes. So they developed, I think Manzanita's one that's done that. They developed dispersion requirements, meaning that so many per block. The pros on that are, you could imagine, you'd be able to spread those out, saying there can only be so many by whatever the distance would be. It would limit that effect of that street end or that area becoming totally into a transient area. The challenges, of course, on that is how far do you spread them out? It does provide a right to the very first person who gets it, and your neighbors are deprived of it, even though it might be compatible. It might not even be a problem by topography on that very street. So it was one where we said those first two kind of problematic, certainly in the toolbox, but we think might not be worth spending a great deal more time on to develop. The next one is very important, and that is in some communities, notably New Orleans, Louisiana, operating Airbnbs have become a big business. It's not uncommon for one operator to have 30 separate individual residences that they're renting continually as Airbnbs. The argument on this one is by letting it become a business like that, it displaces its true use, which is to be residential. And if the intent was to provide a way of making the ends meet for middle class and others, to help pay for the mortgage, to help to be able to buy a home, it's defeated if they're just purely a commercial area. This was a source of great contention in Seattle, for example, and their last approach, I don't know if it was finally adopted, I think it might have been in April, and it's been going through committee since, was to allow you to have one you lived in and one you rented. So you can have up to 2 properties. That's not the case in all communities, but it does give you sort of the magnitude of the issue there that goes forward. We think this might be have some merit to explore a bit, bring out the specifics, look at the folks who are using it, kind of figure out what the right number is and see if it's an issue. In some communities, they've established a minimum home ownership time frame. And the thought on that is you wouldn't go and start accumulating individual places to rent. A good example of this, which I should have used for the last, is there are individuals who buy entire apartment houses in New York City, and they evict everyone, and they all become Airbnb units. The desire to have that limitation on one person or one individual who owns it is also echoed in the minimum home ownership time frame. It's another approach to try to get to the same end, because what they're trying to suggest in this one is you don't just buy it and convert it. If you have to hold it for a period of time, it's a disincentive to commercialize that use. We think it's problematic to enforce. It's hard to keep track of when homes are purchased and when use has changed, and it would be very difficult for us to keep track of. And that makes it one that we're not suggesting at this time to look a little further into. We do think that there should be a limitation on the number of days for rental. I don't know what the number would be. I will say that if a unit is continually rented all the time, it is no longer residential. It is really a commercial use. It's a transient accommodation fully. There needs to be a balance. And I think if we look a little further on this, which we think we might suggest, we'd come back and say, here's how a bunch of communities have sorted the issue. Here's the backstory on why they chose the numbers they did. And it's for you to find out what the right blend would be. In terms of specific standards, many communities, again, we just talked about Seattle, where the owner can be resident and rent one unit, but could have another unit that's solely used, rented on a continual basis for short-term use, with the limitation on number of days that Seattle did establish. We think owner occupancy is really important. These are housing units, and we don't think owner occupancy has to be in every unit at this point, but we do think that we want to make sure that they really are residences at some time. Some communities have had guest limitation. The reason for this is to deal with the potential impacts. Those impacts could include cars and issues associated with noise and too many folks congregating on a location. I mentioned this earlier or later in the presentation, but Bend, Oregon, for example, won't let you rent a short-term rental if you're under 25 years of age. The reasoning on that, it's kind of interesting, is you can't rent a car because you're under 25, because actuarially you have a lot more problems when you rent cars. And if you're under 25, they think you'll have a lot more problems when you rent a unit in a residential area. So that was one they established, and that's the rules. I think in terms of people in bedrooms, tough to keep track of. Tough for us to be able to get our arms around, complaint basis. And again, hard to say how many folks are visiting and how many people are there. Guest limitations, people in bedrooms, but additional people. It really is a limitation on using one of these facilities for something it wasn't intended. In Sonoma, in California, the hearing examiner heard how a Airbnb home was rented for a weekend and had a wedding for 500. That was and they were busted for it and went back for the issue, and it was the argument to remove the permit. Clearly, you limit the number of folks who can congregate there because that wasn't the intent. The availability of the owner-operator. In some communities in Lake Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe, you need to have a sign posted outside the facility, or outside the rented home, or that says, here's how you can contact the owner or the management company. And the reason for that is if there's a problem, you want to make sure that those in the neighborhood know how to contact someone. Beyond that, some communities have regulated that you must have someone within a 2-hour drive who can be at that unit within 2 hours if a problem comes up. So it's 11 o'clock at night, it's a Saturday night. If you call the police because there's noise, they have a few other things likely they're going to be getting to before that. So it may go unresponded. However, the theory on this one is if I can call the owner or operator, and those things are recorded, whether they get the number from a posting or from a city-maintained website, I should get more response in terms of dealing with the issue, because if it's tied to good enforcement, they have the risk of losing their ability to have short-term accommodations. Some things we think in standards do resonate. One is posting of house rules. House rules are intended to inform folks who rent an accommodation for one or more nights about the desire to fit into the community. And house rules are ones that deal with outside noise, deal with parking, deal with other uses on it. Those rules are typically posted inside, and they're the rules that our folks are held accountable for. Some jurisdictions have gone and established noise level limits. I will tell you from our experience, very difficult to ascertain noise as a standard. In essence, noise meters get pinged if something falls off a truck. It's really loud, but it's very short duration. It's hard for us to go out and actually get it, and it has to be continuous enough that we can measure it. So not a real effective means. House rules and quiet hours have seemed to be better used nationwide. I mentioned the age requirement, something to consider. In a college town, it is a challenge. And it is a challenge for use that was not intended for a short-term rental to be used for other means. This could effectively address that. Party limitations, clearly, some communities, I believe Boulder says you can rent a short-term accommodation, but you can't have a keg. You can't have a band. You can't do any of these things they list out. And again, it's trying to preserve the residential character of the neighborhood, make it fit in, and work its way through. Dedicated off-street parking requirements. We think off-street parking is important. We think that it might be accommodated in a different way, and that's the limitation on cars allowed. And the reason for that is that some communities have established strict requirements for off-street parking and limitation on cars together. We'd like to explore that further and bring you back some examples from other jurisdictions. Some communities have adopted a fee in lieu for affordable housing, and the nexus on that is these units that are being rented could be rented for more than 30 days and could go a long way to solving some of the housing demands in the community. Therefore, if you're going to use it for a residential use, you should contribute to affordable housing. It's a good approach in some senses. We're not advocating to look at it too much because it's hard to ascertain how much would be done. And again, by the nature, we have to discuss the nature of the units that are going to be used. They may not lend themselves. If it's a room in someone's home, it may not lend itself to long-term rental too. So it's a little harder to be able to get to. In terms of campers, boats, and recreational vehicles, those are ones that take up a great deal of parking storage. They take up a lot of area. They also can provide a issue where you might have folks who are staying in them on the street as well as staying in the unit, using the unit for facilities. Those are the nightmare stories. There should be some limitation on that. Certainly people do drive RVs and travel and use Airbnbs, though not the Venn diagram of those crossing over is not as great as one might think. You're driving an RV because you're providing your own accommodation, but I'm sure it happens. But I don't think it's very common in some areas, and we'd want to think about how that might work. And clearly in the Lake Whatcom watershed, a number of special issues involved with protecting our drinking water and the uses that should go in. Typically, those units are more tourist-oriented towards those kind of vacation rentals that have amenity. You're close to the water. You're close to, I would say, Fairhaven might very well be similar like that. You're in the center of Fairhaven. You're walking distance from downtown. You're near an attraction or amenity. We would like to suggest that in any of the approaches we go forward with, life safety is clarified, that the units are inspected, that they pass the code requirements. If folks are going to be there, we need to make sure they're safe, and that's a wise approach. They should be licensed and insured. We should make sure that there's protecting the public from any risk of the use occurring, and guests have a reasonable assumption that they're protected too. We believe, like other communities, that there should be a 3 strikes enforcement, and it's a progressive series of enforcement based on complaint. It's one where right now we have a slightly different code system where our typical violations are geared to try to get compliance. Here it has a memory. So if you have code issues that are validated, and they can be validated through an administrative function, you can lose the right to use the facility in the future. And interestingly enough, most of the carriers, the folks who run the websites, they're very supportive of this. They don't want problematic rentals out there that are tarnishing the image of what they convey. We think there should be some regulatory license for these platforms. We think it's very important to recoup the cost associated with it. We don't think it should be punitive, but reflect the actual cost associated with managing the program, getting the applications, reviewing the applications, providing a listing if that's where this goes online of contacts, ensuring that people renew, those kind of things. And finally, outreach. We think outreach is an important component to make sure folks get the message and they understand the limitations and opportunities associated with the use itself. So we're going to conclude and answer questions the Planning Commission might have. I should note in your packet we have a far more detailed matrix of all of these approaches with pros and cons for each one and sites where possible to those jurisdictions using the approaches. We're not offended if we had one that you thought should be applied. We're just looking for direction from you tonight really on what to explore, because the next step for you would be to come back with much more depth on the approaches you think might be more applicable. They still might be discarded, or they might be included, or yet a new approach might be identified by community members or others. Our sense would be is we would come back for a work session based on direction tonight and discussion. That work session would really seek to get broader public comment, perhaps an expanded period. After that, I think we'd be able to get direction from you either at a subsequent work session or even at that meeting, depending if we're hitting the mark on crafting a draft ordinance that could be considered more fully. And that, of course, would go through a public hearing and review both before this body and the City Council. So with that, we would answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Rick and Lisa. And the packet, is this available online?
Yes.
I encourage anyone who hasn't seen the packet to take a look at it. It provides quite a bit more detail on each of the items that Rick touched on, and helps frame each one and the advantages and challenges that each of them has. So it's a good resource. So I think we should just open it up for general discussion and questions. I'm wondering if you have the first page is about the 3 approaches, and the rest of it's kind of about how like the approach that you recommend would be implemented. Do we want to talk about the 3 approaches first, or move into kind of? Broad questions? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So
Same
we,
here.
well, that's fine. We can just open it up, and then if people have specifics, they can ask about them. But Lisa, do you?
I do think it's important to address the first
Do you have your mic?
Sorry. I do think it's important for us to take a look at the three approaches, because if there is consensus that we should not allow it whatsoever, then reviewing everything else in great detail would not necessarily, I mean, we're giving the impression that we're supporting it.
Yeah.
And I'm not, saying one way or the other, but I think maybe that would be the first thing is, do we support having short-term rentals? And then if so, move on to the next.
I think if there's some general questions, maybe we answer those first, because that might influence people's opinion on that. But I agree with what you're saying. There's no point in wasting everybody's time if we're all of one mind that it's not a topic we want to discuss. So how about general stuff first? Iris, do you want to take us away? And then Steve, looks like you had a comment too. I mean, if they're related, just go ahead and why don't you start us out? And
I can also bow out and if
yeah,
needed.
well, let's jump around after we get started.
Perfect. I'm curious, I've done a little bit, read some interesting articles, and I'd love to hear some other resources or ideas for communities that have opened up short-term rentals, how the tourism industry's been impacted both positive and negatively. I'm particularly thinking about, I can think about a lot of the positive impacts, particularly to businesses and local and neighborhoods and downtown, but I'm interested in some of the impacts on our hotel industry in Bellingham. I've noticed, particularly in the last decade, quite a few new hotels that have provided jobs for folks and have been built and are now here and present in our community, and I'm interested in hearing how that's impacted in other communities.
In many of these instances, we'll note it and we'll get materials for you. What I can say is San Francisco ran an initiative that was against further expansion of short-term rentals, and it was backed by the hotel industry in that town. And that was similar to issues in New York, where drivers to get statewide regulation of short-term rentals. For a long time, traditional transient accommodations didn't consider Airbnb and similar short-term rentals competition, but as you saw from the graph, the increase in use is affecting the market itself. We've heard from another number of communities, a standard argument is we're here year-round, we pay lodging tax, our lodging tax goes through and provides for the advertising of the amenities, we help support so much of lodging tax is used for many things that bring people to the community. And up until recently, and not for all platforms, there was a discrepancy in the collection of it. So there was some friction on that. We can certainly talk about the bedrooms, the number of bed nights, I guess is what they call it, where the percentage of occupancy, and track that and compare that to the units. But again, we have a very small, relatively to some of the other cities we saw listing number. But yes, we'll get research for that on you.
Thank you.
Could you get us numbers on how many hotel units are in Bellingham right now? I was curious about that.
Sure.
It's related.
A few related numbers, actually.
Along with the vacancy rates of those rooms for those hotels.
Yeah, that was one that I had, and then, where are those other hotel-related questions? Percent, the percent of our lodging tax and fees that are coming from hotels, or revenue, what that revenue looks like for our community and for the tourism industry. And then on the Bellingham specific paragraph, a few questions that filtered out that I am interested in, and I think you already touched on, that the 346 current listings, we don't know necessarily dispersal-wise if they're more in one even geographic area of Bellingham or neighborhood.
Again, it's hard when you start tracking them down. Some may not even be in Bellingham proper.
Yeah. Okay.
The map does indicate a generalized area. You find out when you put an offer in. That's generally true. However, we do know some. If it's easily obtainable, we'll do it. It's very laborious, obviously, to call them all up and try to find it, but we'll see. We'll find where they are.
Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting. I would hope that we'd be able to try to figure out who some people are who are currently doing this, whether it's with a valid license or not, and engage them in this process and find out what would incentivize them to participate in a valid process and what's worked for them so far, what their neighbors' experiences have been, and that type of thing.
We actually only have like a few B&B permits right now.
Yeah.
Like 2 or 3 out of 340. So, I mean, we could probably ask those couple folks.
We'd have to ask people who are doing it under the radar to
That's
come
what
forward.
I think you
mean,
might
if
hear
we could- if it could
testimony,
be more of a community
I think you might hear
outreach.
testimony from folks who are interested or have experience or are doing it now.
Yeah. I was sorry to chime in, but
Go for it.
I had a question that was super related. We have like I don't know, I'm going to not use the right term, but a tourism board effectively, or a lodging tax board or something in town.
LTAC, the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee.
So that might be a good resource to answer some of these questions in regards that Iris brought up in regards to like how they're feeling about it. I don't know if it makes sense to like when we do a plan like the downtown plan or a plan, we usually get formal comment back from like the Transportation Commission and like the Parks Commission and these other city commissions. And would it be appropriate to ask them formally for some organized comment from their group? Or I don't know how they fall into the whole boards and commission structure, I guess. And
Yeah, their charge is to take the lodging tax and to select activities that encourage people to visit Bellingham.
how they're
So they're
spending the
really
money.
more in
Yeah.
terms of events and marketing. Nonetheless, they are comprised of people who are directly connected to the industry, and informally, they might be able to give us some good feedback. We certainly can reach out to them.
Thanks.
I'd love that, the chamber as well, to hear chamber's feedback.
Oh, hold on. Sorry, Mike. Steve, you had a...
Yeah, a couple comments here and a question. I think this entire exercise is premature. We've identified, we think we have 345 units here in the city of Bellingham, maybe more, maybe less. So what is the problem? Is the problem you're not getting tax money and we want to increase our tax to these future homes and operations? I don't see a problem. In looking back over the last couple of years in our ADU problems and talking about that and bringing in the neighborhood folks, a lot of resistance against that. Parking, noise, different occupation problems. And here we're trying, or we want to increase that problem and start agreeing that there can be more leases out there, 90-day, or not 90, 29-day rentals. I just don't see this. You look at the neighborhoods, you look at Columbia, Birchwood, Happy Valley, Sunnyland, and those people were predominantly against the ADAs, increasing the ADA movement. And here, all we're trying to do, we're trying to increase the problems in our neighborhoods. We haven't heard from the representatives of MNAC. We haven't heard from the representatives of the various neighborhoods in our city as to they want this. Is there a problem with these 345 units? I haven't heard of any so far. So there's been a lot of work in here. I get the funniest feeling that there are folks here that want to move ahead with this regardless of what our input is. And I think we ought to have more input from the people of Bellingham. We either go forward with this or we stop the no regulation. I think that is where we are and what we should do as our first step if in fact we want to go forward with this program.
Is the suggestion that we would take the community's, these groups' opinions, and then that would be the decision made for us?
If you have a majority of the neighborhood saying, no, we don't want it, I think somebody better listen to them.
I don't know. I fear that the voices we hear might not be representative of the entire community. I mean, we have a lot of people who participate a lot, but it's the same people. And I don't agree with the suggestion that the people that we've heard from Columbia and York and Seom and all these neighborhoods you referenced, I live in Columbia, are representative of all the voices in those neighborhoods at all. I know in Columbia neighborhood, there's tons of people who don't participate in the neighborhood meetings who care about the neighborhood because they're too busy or doing something else because they got kids. And so, I don't know. I just disagree with the suggestion. I feel like this is what you want is exactly what we're doing. We're throwing it on the table. We're giving the public an opportunity to participate, but I surely don't want to abdicate our responsibility as the Planning Commission just to the opinions of neighborhood reps.
I don't feel that all this suggested in green, all the suggested rules and codes are just coming out of nowhere. I think it should be vetted, and I don't feel that one or two of these meetings properly vets it. I think we ought to get the neighborhood associations involved and let them give us input. I think this is huge. And again, I see this as just another government program. We're not doing a good job on the ADUs. We don't know where they are. We haven't found them yet. How many of them are out there? We've gone through this so many times. What's the code enforcement? How are we doing out there? And now we want to increase the number of rentals in these areas that we don't even have a handle on what's out there right now.
Well, is the suggestion that we increase? I don't think there's any suggestion to increase anything. It's more just talk about. And if we just ignore it, we'll never know the answers to those questions you just raised.
We don't. What are the problems right now? Where are all the problems?
There are none. I
Then
shouldn't say
why
there are
do we
none,
need
but have-
regulation?
Yeah. Well, anybody else want to chime in on that discussion?
I will say there's problems, but that will be another conversation at some point. I do want to loop back a little bit because I see support. I have a foot on both sides of your table right now. I do think going too far forward is a little bit premature because I do think we need to deal with the ADU situation. And I'm concerned about the numbers because if we're only getting numbers from Airbnb and there's 22 sites, I know people do advertise on more than one site, so getting numbers is difficult. But it's like the ADU situation. I got a feeling there's more than what's showing. I know in my area I have 3 that I can see from my porch. One has a converted garage they live in, but they rent out their house. Somebody else has converted a shed to an Airbnb and rents that out. And then another person rents out a couple of rooms out of their house, and that's less than a block from my place. Now, that might be a dispersion issue, but I think there are neighborhoods where you have the ADUs, you have people putting in ADUs so that they could rent out their house. So we do need to get a handle on it. I don't think it's necessarily a tax thing. It is partially that because I think everybody should pay their fair share. If the hotel industry is paying for advertisement outreach in order to draw people to this great community, then the people who are renting and making money need to pay their fair share for that effort. Because they're getting a free ride currently. And a lot of people are not, I'm assuming, not registered and paying their taxes if we only have 2 people who have licenses. So I do think we need to bring something forward and we need to get our hands around it because when you take a look at that graph, how it's taking off, I don't think that's going to be abated. So if we wait 3-4 years down the line, we could be dealing with 1,000 or more places being converted because why not? I mean, you take a look at colleges, they used to have a lot of people do homestay with students, and it's getting harder and harder to get homestay where somebody gets paid a certain amount of money to take an international student in because now they're renting those out as Airbnb. So they're having to put people in apartments. So I've seen a shift in the last 3 years of how people would make some extra pocket money for their household, shifting it more towards this e-commerce of renting out their house. I think it impacts our affordability to housing because there was an article in the Bellingham Herald where somebody is renting, they bought a house specifically to rent it out on Airbnb, and that is in a single family zone, and that could have been an affordable house for either rental or purchasing. So I don't think it's going to go away, and I don't want to ignore it, but I do think we need to really get a handle on having an ADU ordinance in place because this will have to piggyback on that because there's going to be areas that are greatly impacted. Even though Lake Waukem's not our area to be, so much mandating that, but Fairhaven, the single-family neighborhoods around the university. You think of where people are going to go to rent. Those places are going to get impact, and I'm cautious about moving too far into this when we don't have, I think, another huge thing figured out yet. So that's one of my concerns.
Curious what you think, how you would gauge the public's awareness of the current laws around having an STU. I mean, if I was a homeowner, I was going away for a summer, I might think, great, I'm going to put my house up on this website, and I might not, if I wasn't aware, I might not even think about looking at the regulations. And I think before we have a conversation around what regulations should be put in, whose community input should, I'm just curious what you think people are currently thinking.
So we're not advocating this, but many cities hire a service. There's several of them. They monitor all of the sites. They send out the dunning letters. They do the enforcement. They ensure compliance. So
Do you think the communities that broadly are communities currently aware that it's illegal to put your house up as an Airbnb? Or that?
I think there are folks who don't know the zoning laws. We deal with them every day in enforcement, and often these are folks who are unaware of the requirements or rules. However, the public interest needs to be determined. In those communities that have chosen not to regulate this at all, just to allow it to occur, they believe their public interest is served by just allowing folks to do it. That in the bundle of sticks for property rights, this is a right apparently folks have. I would suggest that most communities that allow this realize it needs to be a level playing field, that to display, it's a type of accommodation that often doesn't compete with other accommodations that are currently in place. It can, in the appropriate context, be good for communities. The key is to find out what's right. And what we tried to present tonight is the range of approaches. We would be remiss not to address it. And I will say that causality is different. One can't say we're just going to shine these on. If you choose to say we shouldn't regulate it, then you need to change your zoning to say that transient accommodations are allowed in residential areas. And then when the unit next door is converted to a hotel and they complain, we'd say, well, the community said that's in the public interest. I can't imagine that happening. So I do think we're trying to get ahead of a curve on an issue that's emerging. We talked to you a year ago and said this is emerging. We tried to get there when we had some time. We had significant testimony from the very same neighborhood groups that you mentioned telling us to do this, asking us to pursue it. When are you going to address it in this chamber? That's why we move forward. That's why council said we should move forward on it.
Do you see a neighborhood saying no, one neighborhood saying no, and one neighborhood saying yes?
I agree the neighborhoods don't agree, so it's very likely. I do think that, as I said before, one size does not fit all. One size does not fit all. And the reason is we have such different context. I would argue if a condominium association in Fairhaven voted and said we should allow transient accommodations and everyone agreed, we might consider it. All the neighbors got together, they all voted. However, if the same building has the right to do this too, through private CC&Rs, voted and said we shouldn't do any, then they shouldn't do it. So I think it isn't a one-size-fits-all. And I think what we're trying to get our arms around here is where does it apply? What are the standards? What are we trying to accomplish? I will always advocate the minimum regulations necessary to achieve the public end. We don't want to get a big new program. If you can make it simple, we'd be pleased. Let's see what we're trying to achieve.
Mike, you had some comment you wanted to make? Maybe a question?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that. I think it is, I was looking at the numbers, like we're comparable to Missoula right now in population and the same, we're upper 200s, 300s. But you look at Bend, Oregon, similar population, it's 10 times higher, 2,000-ish listings on Airbnb. and Bend has that feel of a recreation destination that sometimes is associated with Bellingham, and that's continuing to increase people's awareness of the recreation opportunities here in both the winter and summer. I worry that, as others have said, this might snowball ahead of us, and we could see 1,000 listings a year from now if we're not proactive and continue to work through what we want to see here. And I had a question on the hotel line of thinking earlier. For context, what would be the barrier to someone buying an apartment building and converting it to a hotel in, say, an urban village, and then doing something similar with like a single family home in a neighborhood? Like what is that impossible? Is that very difficult? Is that just, what does that look like?
Absent the building code issues, because once you go up to a commercial or accommodation, it raises state requirements for sprinklers, fire alarms, separations, fire doors, things like that. Absent that, in terms of pure land use, if a piece of property had an apartment house and that piece of property zoning also allowed hotels, motels, or others, you could convert. So it slowly becomes a life safety or building code issue.
Iris, you had a comment?
Yes. Sorry. One of the things I'm interested in, or that I'm curious about, is if there's the potential for a progressive either tax system or fee system that would level the playing field for someone who's renting a room in their house to help pay their mortgage versus someone who, if we didn't have the requirement that a property owner was living with, that was their main residence, someone bought an apartment building and had Airbnb on each of the condos or the apartments in that unit, there seems like the amount of money that person could make versus the person renting out their room is so sizably different that to then just charge this one fee per unit or this one fee for them to license seems unfair. And I'd be interested if there's any possibility of coming up with a fairer system based on the income potential that someone would be making.
Fees are set by the council, but Planning Commission could advise on a progressive scheme. So that would not be uncommon because, again, there is a difference between that one room and an entire house in terms of logistics and management and issues and all of those things. And I think that's one thing we need to talk about is perhaps the scalar part of that. It could be a bedroom and families still living there. I think we probably have less resistance to that. Or it could be a rental of an entire apartment, condo, or residence, and that might have some more issues in some circumstances.
Lisa, I think you mentioned that one of the communities that you looked at had different type of permits for different things. So yeah, they set thresholds. That wasn't a fee, but maybe a fee. If it's just a bedroom, it's a type 1 and it's a $50 application fee. And if it's a whole house, it's a type 2 and it's more, maybe there's a way to deal with that.
Punitive in the grand scheme of how much more money income someone would be making if they were to purchase condos. But I liked that.
Some way to.
Another curiosity I have, and I can certainly see why it'd be difficult, but it struck me as interesting that it was highlighted in one of the regulations. Pardon me, it's on page 2 in the limitation of the properties an owner may own and operate as an STR, that then at the bottom it's that renters can't rent their rental property even though the landlord gives permission. And I do understand how challenging that would be, and yet in a community like Bellingham where almost 60% of our properties are occupied by renters, and so many of them might be students who spend their summers abroad or people who work in different communities or who may have an extra bedroom to rent. I know it's risky, but is there a possibility of looking at, and have other communities looked at, allowing renters with landlord permission to operate some type of Airbnb?
Yeah, I don't see why it couldn't occur, just in terms of strict structure, but it might. Again,
Feels restrictive not to.
yeah, and it's, again, when we deal, after you pass that first threshold, if you wish to regulate it or not, if you go through regulation, you decide your approach, then you say, what are we trying to achieve? That probably would be the first discussion. We're trying to protect against this. We're trying to achieve this. Then you come back saying, what opportunities can you provide? You know, what's within the set of allowed uses? I don't know. I think subletting occurs a great deal. I know most university communities always have subletting in the summer. Students are required often till at least for an entire year. They're not there in the summer. They find a sublet, and typically it requires permission of the landlord. If it was more than 29 days, it wouldn't matter. It's a residential use, 30 days or more, but it's the question of less than 29 days. I don't know. That's something to be discussed. I don't know if anyone does that. We can certainly take a look.
I mean, I definitely saw cities that didn't allow it, but I didn't specifically see any that permitted it, but maybe they were just silent on it instead of saying, we don't allow it.
Mike? do you have
It seems very difficult. As a renter, there's so many private barriers to renting out doing a short-term rental as well. Like, I'm in a multifamily building, and our HOAs prohibit renting less than 30 days. So it's not an option for me as an owner or a renter. But if you, for some reason, have that relationship with your landlord and are able to, it seems an arbitrary restriction to not allow, you know, to participate in the sharing economy, which is an increasingly popular thing to do, shouldn't require home ownership necessarily. Like it seems so infrequent to occur that the city doesn't necessarily need to prohibit that.
Yeah, I can see where there might be some safety concern and that a tenant may not be as aware of, but I hope our rental registration is taking care of that anyway, and that hopefully their houses are some of the safest in the community.
Yeah, that's true. Those are the ones that are inspected.
Yes.
The owner-occupied ones aren't inspected.
I'd like to circle back real quick to kind of the initial comments that Steve, you and Lisa made. And I understand where you're coming from. And I'm not by any means settled on this issue. I think it's really complex. And since we got this packet, I've been talking to people in the community basically every day over the past couple weeks, asking them. And people have been bringing it up on their own just because it's an interesting topic. But I'm concerned about diverting from what is our regular process. Our regular process as the Planning Commission is to take items that we've already discussed being important, like Rick said, and that the community to a certain degree has expressed interest in discussing, and then bringing that forward in a forum where we discuss it and we get the facts and we consider all of those components, and then we make a recommendation one way or the other. And if our recommendation, after getting informed from the public and the staff and whatever other questions we ask, is that we don't think this is something more that warrants proceeding on, then that's the recommendation we make. But to preempt that discussion just because we don't have support from particular groups in the community, whether they're the hotel groups or the neighborhoods or the chamber or anything, I think is not how we normally operate. And you raised a really two conflicting points. We should wait for ADUs to be addressed, but if we don't get on this, it could balloon into a huge problem. And I think that's much more risky because Airbnbs are not just ADUs, they're all sorts of other things. And they have components of our affordability discussion and, you know, how do we make wages for people go up so they can afford to live in their home, and behavioral issues and taxes, and there's all these things that have nothing to do with AD. Well, some of them overlap with ADUs, but others don't at all. We need to resolve the ADU issue, but that's not, in my personal opinion, that doesn't preclude a discussion about short-term rentals. And I'd like to hear from both of you.
If I could, just we'll be discussing ADUs starting in September.
That's a good,
we figured
thank you.
that this was a good way to introduce the issue, gives us time to do the research. We'll come and bring and present the ADUs. Then when we do research on that, we'll come back with what we've learned on this. And that way they can proceed in parallel, sort of stagger step a little bit, and inform each other's discussion.
I was going to very similarly request something similar because I do think ADU does have a huge impact on neighborhoods, single-family neighborhoods, and high desired areas
I agree
for
with that, yeah.
rental. And, you know, you excluded or didn't green highlight the dispersion requirement, and I see where that would be very important. It's tandem with the ADU because you could have someone occupying a bedroom of a house renting out 3 bedrooms, but they have if we, we don't know if this will happen, but if detached ADUs were allowed, and then they rent that out, you all of a sudden in a single-family neighborhood end up in a boarding house situation. There's a lot of possibilities, and so it's really hard for me to go forward and say, okay, this is how I think this would work really well. I do think we need something, but I'd really like to know how one effect is going to have on a single-family neighborhood, so then we can decide, is dispersion important here in order to not saturate some of the neighborhoods and blocks by over-rental with a lot of cars and noise and everything else that we may not be mitigating in this.
If I could, just, boy, I feel like the coming films. I could tell you the teaser of the next movie. Our AED ordinance that likely will become before you, that's result of working with our ad hoc group and doing a great deal of outreach, will only advocate allowing, in places that they're not currently allowed, detached ADUs only in Happy Valley. There's not a change proposed. And as you know, detached ADUs are allowed throughout the city. So we're not increasing the number of ADUs that could be constructed, detached ADUs, at least at this point, in terms of the ordinance coming forward, in any area other than Happy Valley, who, as you might recall, it was a neighborhood that came to the city and asked for that to be investigated and had strong participation by over 100 community members to see if that project could proceed. You'll see that one in September.
At least it's a great point. That's an important topic, I think. Of all the ones that were white, that's probably the single most important one. But that's exactly why we should have these work sessions and talk about it and get informed, because we need to be really informed. And I would expect that the staff would give us as much time as we need on this topic. So if we have a whole slew of work sessions and Commissioners, Steve, you or others are not satisfied with the amount of information we have, then we hold off on our decision-making process. There's no reason to rush it, but there's definitely discussion to be had. Mike and then Iris.
One of the proposed green sections is to specifically addresses ADUs, so that it proposes that you'd have to have owner occupancy of 1 if the other's rented out. There's a lot of existing detached ADUs that predate any that exist right now, way more than will be built by a future ADU ordinance over the next 5 years, and it would be beneficial to get STR regulations in place to cover the existing ADUs, and that's way more impactful than like the 10 that are going to be built in the next year or 2.
Well, it sounds like, there's a lot of unpermitted living units that are detached currently, and if they're not allowed in single-family neighborhoods, then those won't ever be in compliance, and so the city would have to deal with that. Then the next springboard is, do we allow detached Airbnb in those areas? And so knowing how one thing fits in will help us decide how the other one would look, or if it's going to mirror it. So, there are a lot of detached out there, but whether or not they can be brought into compliance will be dependent on those decisions made in the future.
There's an opportunity here where someone right now could have a detached ADU and be renting out both on Airbnb, theoretically. And we have an opportunity to put this forward to require only being able to rent out 1 on an STR basis. And that's currently not something that we can enforce.
Yeah, and if we had a regulatory structure and ADUs are not expanded, detached, then that's just one more, for those people who are opposed to that, that's one more stick for them to say, well, you're not licensed as a short-term rental. You not only do you have an illegal ADU, but you're also not licensed as short-term rental. So I don't think we could supersede the prohibition on a detached accessory structure by allowing detached short-term rentals, because you'd still have to legalize that detached accessory. In my mind, the rules would be laid out, so you'd still have to legalize that. I don't think that's a back door, and maybe staff can comment on that, but I don't see how we could create a back door to use short-term rentals to legalize a detached accessory structure that wasn't previously legal.
And I think it's the way, well, candidly, we would probably have some sort of vetting to say, is this legally established?
Yeah.
And if you're not legally established, you can't be
Exactly.
detached or attached or any kind of a short-term rental. I will say that the reason it's so easy relatively to monitor short-term rentals is because the web is the way they make connection, And if it's on the web, they can be monitored. If they can be monitored, they can be located fairly quickly. So illegal enforcement, the reason they have these various concerns that are willing to do it is they develop algorithms that read the programs, and they compare them to the records. And if it's not listed on the list, that starts an enforcement action. It's pretty straightforward. If it's not removed from the web and it's illegal, they're fined. And that's a straight writing a fine rather than having to go to court. So, I mean, it's easier to enforce against than most uses because of the narrow means it's advertised.
So it's even easier potentially to enforce than rentals, traditional rentals.
Yes,
Interesting.
yes.
Iris? Oh, sorry, Steve. Go
If
ahead.
you were to take everything you proposed in green and put it into effect, what is that going to do to our enforcement, code enforcement strengths, and also our staff strengths to support a program that's outlined just like this?
Let me clarify. It's a very good question. Let me clarify. When we have something in green, we're not advocating we implement it. We're advocating we want to look into it and see if it's applicable. We know that there are some that will fall away and some will resonate to meet the issues you've identified. We can't look at all of these and do the detailed research. Our hope today was sort of to cull some out and say these and others are like things you've identified you want additional information on, are the things you'd like to see to solve it. We could see, looking at this, to actually go look at the jurisdictions, find out more about how they were applied, see if they were effective, and report back to you. And you'll come to that conclusion, this tool is a good tool or not a good tool. Or if we change this tool this way, it might work. So I think it's more of us trying to be more efficient on what we look at than to say we're going to do everything that's listed.
Well, I understand that, but my concern is the amount of investigation and snooping, or however you want to put it, code enforcement into these articles, that I'm concerned that you're going to have to raise your staff, you're going to have to increase code enforcement. I drive around the city, of course, all the time, and I see code violations all over the place. And so how are you ever going to enforce this program? We can't even enforce the ADUs right now. We're not out there finding out what's out there. Hopefully we will. And I think that's where we wanted to go. But I just think it's just more government regulation that's not going to be enforced.
Well, we might disagree because I think that unregulated, the risks to the communities are great. And I think that this is emerging. I could see the numbers of units being expanded. I could see it being inappropriately applied, corrosive to certain areas where there are no residents any longer. The neighborhoods that we value so much are displaced. At the same token, I have to make full disclosure. When I travel, I like staying in Airbnbs. They're really cool. I like living in neighborhoods and having a time. So there is some sort of medium that we could find that's the balance. That's the role of this body, to tee up for the City Council what they think is the best balance between regulation and ensure that it can be enforceable and preserve what we value most importantly. And this is a really good issue to tackle because there are a number of facets on it. One can identify with the property owner who's renting out a unit or who's gone, a teacher at Western who's gone in the summer, who wants to rent out their house in the summer, pick up some dollars. But we could also identify with the next door neighbor to that teacher who says, I don't want to see a new person there every day, all day for the summer for 60 days, and want to have some sort of assurance that there's going to be quiet and there won't be more cars and there won't be that wedding that happened in Sonoma there. So my hope is we find that blend because I do think it's a good use for our community and I do think it's appropriate. It is premature for staff to say we think we know how to do this because we're just peeling back the layers of the onion and identifying approaches. We can research those, but it's for you to tell us which blend is best.
Thank you, Eric. Actually, just real quick to follow on that, is the idea, though, that the fees that we collect, just kind of like rental reg, would go toward the issue.
Cover the expenses?
I'm not saying it would. I'm just saying, is that the kind of the back idea to it, is you collect the fees and
Yeah, it would be proportionate to, unless the strand you pursue is one of dealing with like a fee in lieu for affordable housing. Some communities have done that. Typically, the fees are assessed solely to cover the cost of the program. If you are concerned with enforcement as being a key component, we can tell you how much these services quote per year to do the enforcement for you. They're very efficient, much more efficient than we'd be. And they're proactive because they're not waiting for a complaint basis. They're monitoring every day the web. I know that sounds very Big Brother-like, but it is very effective, and it ensures folks are registered. And if you have a relatively reasonable program, not very costly, reasonable standards are out there, most people register. That's been the experience.
yeah. Iris, you comment, and then Lisa.
Yeah, I just wanted to share overall where I'm, my temperature right now is certainly that we need to move forward in discussing this, the sharing economy, whether it's in cars, in Craigslist, or in homes, is proliferating, and there's nothing we can't sit back and think that if we don't address it, that it will flatline. And I certainly think there's an important safety concern to both our residents, whether they be neighbors of people who have short-term rentals or people who are coming into our community, is high. And I certainly think there's a lot of opportunities. I love staying in Airbnbs. When I go to a community, it helps me walk out of someone's front door and feel like I'm a neighbor and get to know what a community might be like. At the same time, I also have a lot of friends who work in the hotel industry or in the tourism industry in Bellingham that would either benefit or that might be harmed by this, and I think we should engage them in the conversation. I think there's a great opportunity in Bellingham in that most of our hotel industry is along the I-5 corridor, either in North or town or over in the Samish Lakeway area, and there's a big part of our community that is missing in terms of being an area where people can stay and feel like they're parts of different neighborhoods. And so I do hope that as we move forward, something that we look at, though each neighborhood is going to need different things, is that we encourage each neighborhood to take a little bit on of this economy and bring a little bit more people into their neighborhood and highlight what's important to them about their neighborhood. I think that's something that Bellingham offers as a richness, is a diverse neighborhood feel where you can be in one neighborhood and visit, visit Elizabeth Park and Elizabeth Station, and then you can go to South Hill and visit campus. And if not all neighborhoods are willing to step forward and participate, that would be really disappointing and I think detrimental to this process.
Lisa, thanks. Iris.
I also agree, so the first step I wanted to do, I guess we're kind of beyond that, but I also agree we need to bring this forward. Again, I'd like to see the ADU because I think some of the decision-making there would frame some of my concerns and requests here. I would like to see dispersion added to something that is focused on, primarily because of the ADU and density in some of our dense neighborhoods. I agree the limitation on total number citywide would not be the best thing to pursue because that doesn't prevent clustering. And so there are some neighborhoods that may not be as desirable to put something in versus another area, but maybe it would be if an area was already saturated. I'm thinking of areas around the university or around Fairhaven, some of the more centralized areas for people who would want to stay, walk out the front door and go someplace close, or the reason why they're visiting. But I don't want to see a block that has 12 houses have 8, attached ADUs and then 4 Airbnb, because I think the saturation and density would exceed a comfortable living area for certain neighborhoods. So dispersion, I think, would be important, and I'd like to see that dispersion looked at in the framework with ADU so that we can balance the proper density in some of these neighborhoods that I think are going to be most impacted. So that's kind of where my frame of mind is. I think it's great. Airbnb, I think, is a good commerce for people. It could help folks with payments of houses or maybe paying for their kids' college or vacation. But if I was to pick one apple and one pear over here, I'd rather see ADU because it creates affordable housing theoretically within areas. And if we're looking at allowing people to utilize a single-family home for financial assistance or financial gain, and that was the whole catalyst with, we need ADUs because it creates affordable housing, which I'd like to still see the data on that. And also it helps people maintain or stay in their homes. The Airbnb type commerce can do the same thing, but I think as far as benefit for community, I think people long-term resident, when we have a housing crisis, makes more sense to put our eggs in that basket. Not to eliminate this, but use this a little bit more judicially within certain neighborhoods than, just saturation. That's my concern.
So we could probably get some more feedback on maybe examples of other communities that have instituted dispersion as part of moving forward, so we have more info on that. Sounds like you guys have some comments. Mike, and then
my
Iris.
last thoughts, I had a thought and a question. I do see an opportunity for tiers of some kind. Your casual rent out a spare bedroom sporadically, or if you go to Whistler for a week, you rent out for a week and you only do it once a year, has different impacts both to your neighbors and to the economy of rentals and housing prices versus someone who is doing it as an investment or as a business. And it's just a different tier of impacts on a number of different points. And so at both the fee level and the restriction level, people who are renting out their bedroom while they're still there in that house, that may not need dispersion. But people who are doing it as buying a property as a business may be more appropriate for dispersion, or different things like that. So and my curiosity is, different cities, what have they seen in the compliance rate? Would be interesting if that's something we can get. And relative to the fees, like Bend seemed to have very expensive fee structure, and a few of the other cities had pretty inexpensive, $50, almost nominal. Is there a compliance difference in the level of the fees?
I was just going to share, I was curious, and I thought others might be curious too. In Bellingham right now, I lost a page to see how many listings there were, but the average cost for a unit is, or average cost for staying in an Airbnb is $113 a night, and that ranges from $20 a night all the way up to, I think there was about 4 units that were over $1,000. 3 of them were boats, which is interesting. I didn't even think about how people could be renting out their boats, pay for their slip.
You said the average was 120?
113.
113.
That's interesting, and I just want to make one comment about that kind of ties back to at least what you were talking about affordability, and I think we might tend to focus on other issues in this discussion, like impacts to neighbors and what's going to happen to my parking on my street and taxes and things like that. But underlying all of this is our housing crisis and the affordability of housing in our community. And that discussion comes into play in our comp plan and ADUs and the subdivision ordinance and Airbnb. And we don't have the luxury, in my opinion, of choosing one of these resources to help this problem that we have that's community-wide. We have to look at all of them. We have to put all the eggs in the basket and make sure they're all balanced. I think your comments about dispersion and the impacts of ADU versus Airbnb is really insightful. We need to look into that further, but we can't, we're going to be kidding ourselves if we think, oh yeah, we'll just do this one thing and it's going to fix the problem. We have a homelessness problem. We have housing problems for people who make decent wages It's all the way up and down the spectrum. And as a community, we have an obligation, like as human beings, to look out for all these people. And Iris, you're right. It may require every single neighborhood in this town to chip in a little bit. And that might mean that as a community, we have to make sacrifices a little bit. But I mean, I'm just running the numbers on this stuff. If you make $25 an hour in Bellingham, that's 50 grand a year. That's a decent wage in Bellingham, right? That's going to get you at 30% of your annual income. That's going to get you $15,000 that you can spend on your mortgage, because that's what they say, right? Affordability is 30% of your wage. That's $1,250 a month. That's probably less than $200,000 mortgage, and there's no houses for sale in Bellingham for 200 grand. They're way more than that. If you rent a room for $113 a night for 5 months in the summer, that's 150 days. That's $17,000 pre-tax, but that's maybe 12 grand that you put in your family's pocket, and that's a big deal. My brother lives in Greenwood, and he has an Airbnb in his basement, and he's a teacher, and they make almost as much money on the Airbnb as that he does teaching. And it affords them the ability to live in the $800,000 house that they live in, because that's what it costs to buy a house in Greenwood. And we're not there yet, but we're going that direction. And so I just think, for me personally, that needs to be a critical component of this. Like, what are we doing as a community to address this housing issue? And is this a critical part of it? And can we address the concerns that the community has about safety and dispersion, all these issues, through good standards? Can we solve all those problems and still get the win? And I would hope that that is a critical component of our discussion as we move forward. And if anybody else has any questions, shoot. But I have one other technical question that I ended up saving.
I had just one other question. I'd love to have a conversation about, I know that a lot of what happens when you come up with regulations like this is, what's the stick going to be? To enforce the code? I'd love to think creatively and engage the community in creative conversation about what's the incentive for participating in this program. And I don't have any answers to that, but it'd be really nice if there was, rather than just a code enforcement, how do we get people to pay this small nominal fee? How do we encourage people to participate in this program? And then the other thing that was not in green here that I'd love, I hope we'll continue to consider and talk about, is the fee in lieu to affordable housing fund. And if part of that incentive could be participating in a program that then, rather than just going towards more enforcement, towards someone driving around looking for code violators or for computer software to figure out who's breaking the code, if rather it went towards something that people felt really positive about contributing to.
I just had a technical question. One of these is about limitation on the number of days. How does that work practically? Like, if I have it, let's say I do have a legal ADU, and I decide I'm going to rent it in Airbnb, and the city says we're going to let you do 90 days a year. So what happens with the other 270 days? Is that housing stock sit vacant? Because you can't lease it to someone for 45. No one's going to rent it for 45 days or 60 days. You know, these interim gaps. Is that, how does that get addressed in the context of limiting the number of days?
Well, it's reporting now. Remember, the carriers report the number of days for each property, so it's easy to monitor. The number, whatever that right number is, and it varies across the country, was designed to say it really truly was accessory. It was somebody who lived there, who for a period of time was off skiing, traveling, wanted to do it for a period of time for that. But that was sort of the blend. It was a, and I don't mean to be flippant, but it's sort of like having a garage sale. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a use you have to raise money. They put a finite thing. You can't have, in many communities, garage sales every weekend. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a limited number. So you can rent these out, but only for a limited number. And they felt that kept it from being converted to purely a transient accommodation. And it preserved for the neighbors a certainty that, yeah, there's a couple weeks a year somebody else will be using it. Helps these folks out. You have the same right too if you apply, follow the rules. but the general character was preserved. How one finds that right number and how Seattle was 17, came to 17, I think. Santa Fe came to 17, is an interesting story. And what we'd probably do is call and say, give us your thought pattern that led to this conclusion, and come back to you with it.
Okay, thanks. So some direction. Does anybody have any other comments right now for staff?
I would also note, as if you review this and have comments between now and September, please just email them to us, because we'd sure like to come back with the materials for you to have a more robust discussion. And I think you might hear from public comment shortly a number of thoughts that will help us frame the discussion.
Definitely. And so what we've heard is some additional comments beyond the green items on dispersion and some of the tourism impacts. I see comment on, understanding how this interfaces with the tourism industry a little bit, and a few other items, which I'm sure you noted. and again, by no means is the idea that we're moving forward with an ordinance, right? This is just a chance for us to get the discussion topics out there and then hear back and then talk more.
I hope at the end of the evening you feel the efficacy of just talking about the issue helps us frame some of the concerns, and it helps us have the time to focus our efforts. We want to be as economical as possible, but get you the things you need to move.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. That was a good discussion. We often don't get such interesting discussions and varied opinions on stuff, so it's always fun to kind of hear everybody's thoughts, and appreciate that. So I think with that, we'll kind of end the discussion portion of the work session and hear public comment. And of course, if questions come out of that, we can direct them back at staff or whatever afterwards. But let's hear from the public. So with that, we've got 4 people who signed up. I'm sure there's other people who want to comment. You don't have to sign up to comment, but we'll go through the 4 people who signed up first. And then once we get through that 4th person, if there's anybody else who'd like to comment, just come on down and kind of wait in line against the wall there, and then make sure you state your name and address and share your thoughts with us, and we'll give you 3 minutes to talk to us each. And the first person on the list is Jane Bright. Thank you, Jane. And I'll give everyone a heads up when they get to around 30 seconds so that they know, so they're not surprised by the buzzer.
Or jump.
Yeah, it can be shocking.
Thank you. My name is Jane Bright. I live at 306 Highland, and I'm on the board of the South Hill Neighborhood Association. So in answer to one of the questions about what do the communities think about this, my comments are going to be an extrapolation of some of the ADU conversations we had at multiple meetings. And if you know South Hill, you know we get a good turnout at those meetings. And I would say that one of the things I am encouraged to hear you talking about is the context of the whole housing issue. What I do not hear and would like to hear more about is the fact that Western Washington University has between 11 and 12,000 people who live off campus. And therefore, if you extrapolate those numbers of 3 to 4 people per unit that they're renting, that could be 2,000 to 3,000 housing units, probably mostly in Bellingham, a lot in my neighborhood. But I think it's important to look at those, because those are transient renters. And when you talk about the neighborhood character, those students, and I'm surrounded by them, and they're great, but they're different in terms of their commitment to the neighborhood than to those of us who are either owners or renters. So please factor that in. And this conversation has been interesting, because I think the dispersion requirement is important, because you do have clusters of communities that have much higher rentals, particularly from students, than you do have others. And I think that it should be a very integrated kind of approach to transient. And you know, the ADU, the illegal ADU next to me is rented, for example, for a couple months this summer by one of the students, and a house below me is rented, and when they put it on the market, they say a maximum 6-month rental cannot be renewed. So this is a complex issue. Meantime, we have 12 students who at the Lowell School who are homeless. So so I'm very pleased to hear the recognition about the complexity of this and the importance of looking at this from the big picture. And the other thing to just, and I know you know this, but I think I have to remind you, excuse me, that there is enormous frustration now with the whole ADU situation because of lack of enforcement. And there's great frustration with the city because we have these boarding house situations where the regulation is no more than 3 people who aren't related to each other in a house. So for you folks to come and say, okay, now we're going to have regulations about ADUs, I think candidly that you're going to face a credibility issue. So just, as I say, I know you know this, but again, just please continue to look at it from the whole standpoint of housing affordability. That housing affordability has 2 sides because every time you take a unit out and put it in the rental program, you're denying it for somebody to purchase. And when you make it transient housing, you take it away for permanent renters. So I just encourage you to keep doing what you're doing and looking at this from the big picture down. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Jane.
I will bring it up at our next meeting. If we're having next meeting September 6th, and I'll throw that on the agenda and let you know what I hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Carrie Blackwood, and then Carter, and then Karen.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I think what's most heartening tonight, Carrie Blackwood, this was addressed to 1123 19th Street. And what's heartening about this discussion is I think each of you reflect a perspective that's in our community, and so I think that'll be helpful moving forward. And I really am grateful for the work that you're doing and the comments that were made tonight. I do want to touch on a couple things, though. When we're moving forward on this, I would ask you to really say, is there a reason to distinguish between short-term rentals and a month-to-month rental in this case? Is there something really different about a short-term rental than the month-to-month rental? And so some of the concerns that you're hearing raised, whether it be parking or people coming and going or noise or I don't know those people, is there really a difference between someone having it for 30 days and somebody having it for a week? One of the things that's interesting under the current Bellingham rules is that really there's this weird gray period between 2 weeks and a month. So really we're talking about the difference of 2 weeks. And so when you're making a rule, and I think this speaks a little bit to Steve's comments, and hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I think that does speak to this a little bit because they're saying, why do we want to do something different here? And I think Whatcom County spoke to that. And Whatcom County came and said, you know, really, we're not finding a reason to distinguish, and there may be a reason at some point to do so, but I'm not seeing it right now. And do we want to put rules and regulations in place that aren't necessary at this time? I'm not saying I'm advocating for that, but when you're reviewing that, I ask that you take that look to determine whether there's a reason to distinguish. I also don't want you to put the needs of the hotel industry that has been incredibly aggressive in promoting their interests on this ahead of the needs of our community. You will note, if you do research on this, that the largest growing number of Airbnb folks are empty nester women over the age of 60 who are trying to make ends meet. And I think some of the comments that you're hearing today, I know Airbnb put my husband through college, and I know there are other people who have similar circumstances like that, whether they're teachers or they're people living in communities. The other thing is, I have to also say, I don't have too much time, but I am concerned about the owner occupancy. Again, I think this is the question of, is there a difference between month to month? Can we narrowly tailor restrictions to meet what our actual needs are? I think there's a lot of emotion and fear and assumption, but we cannot make good rules for our community based on those things. So let's not come from that perspective.
About 30 seconds.
Yeah, and the last couple things, limit on the number of days. I would really caution you on that one because that will really, oh, that's my own timer, that'll really stop the ability to actually make this function. So I really caution you on that one. And I don't even know how that would make sense at all. And then lastly, just from an emotional component, I'm hugely supportive of Yes in My Backyard. I have the wealth and privilege to live in Fairhaven, and I know it's only because I'm wealthy and privileged. And I want to have as many people enjoy my community as possible in as many ways and support our local tourism. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay, Carter, and then Karen, and then anybody else who'd like to speak.
Hi, my name's Carter Maiden. My address is 1133 19th Street, kind of Fairhaven, Happy Valley area as well. And I think it's important in this kind of discussion for me to distinguish myself as I have no family member that has ever made any money from Airbnb, and I have never made any money from Airbnb, although I definitely could. It would be quite easy for me to do it. Although it's illegal, apparently it's not enforced. And my personal experience in my own neighborhood, I would say I've experienced loss of neighborhood character due to short-term rentals. And right now, I can see 5 or 6 from my property, which kind of goes to that dispersion issue. I don't have neighbors, and I would like to have neighbors. And I would like, I guess I'd like this group to understand, the Planning Commission to understand that there are people like myself in this town that say, I think Bellingham should follow the lead of Port Townsend and Durango in prohibiting short-term rentals. I'm sure that Durango is a tourist-based economy. I'm guessing they still have tourists. Same goes for Port Townsend. And the entire term, the sharing economy, I find offensive. It's just straight up pure capitalism brought from the corporations to the masses. Now I can be a capitalist pig and I can run a business out of my garage selling things on Craigslist. I can rent my car on Uber. I can rent my bedroom on the internet. So the sharing economy I find offensive. This is, I think, a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons, which is like the atmosphere. That's the commons. We can dump whatever we want to into the atmosphere. The commons that we're losing now is the neighborhood. I would say I've lost my neighborhood character because of short-term rentals. And what's my options? I can join them. I can try to find a house where there's a homeowners association that will prevent it. I can move to Chuckanut Ridge where there's a gate that will prevent it. But I don't really have any options. I guess I can move to Durango. And in Bellingham, this enforcement based on complaints, that doesn't work because, yeah, I complained about short-term rentals in my neighborhood. The reason it doesn't work is people don't want to turn in their neighbors because they don't want their neighborhood to turn into a contentious place, which is exactly what happened in my neighborhood. I'm not calling on anybody else on the short-term rentals because I already have one neighbor that looks at me like they might rather me be dead. I don't want that to be all of my neighbors or more of my neighbors.
About 30 seconds, Carter.
So, again, I guess I would advocate, please look into that Port Townsend, look into that Durango. How did that work? Is it working? And short-term rentals are commodifying my neighborhood, and that's something I paid a lot of money for.
Thank you. So Karen is next. Okay, thank you. So you mean just kind of skip your time? Okay, thank you. So, sir, if you'd like to come up to the microphone and share with us.
Hi, I'm Peter Fraser. I live at 263 Chuckanut Point Road. And thank you, Lisa and Rick, for the work that you've done on this, and thanks so much to Planning Commission for your volunteer work on this really important and interesting issue. It's been fascinating to listen to you. It's something I have been living for about 4 years. I have 3 vacation rentals, 2 on Chuckanut Point Road, 1 on Garden Street. And my wife and I have really enjoyed the experience of having people in our home, welcoming people to Bellingham, to Whatcom County, and sharing with them the beautiful places that we have and that we've created. We've loved it so much, in fact, we bought an old motel, the Lions Inn, turned it into a hotel. So I can speak to, from the vantage point of somebody who has vacation rentals and somebody who has a hotel. Tax collection, very important. And don't just assume that Airbnb people are not collecting taxes. If you do Airbnb, you are collecting taxes. It's required. And health and safety, very important. That's why regulation, I think this needs to be regulated, because it needs to be fair, it needs to be a level playing field. It gives us, as a community, more control over this situation. One point I'd like to make is that month-to-month rentals and short-term rentals are not actually all that different. In fact, there's an advantage to short-term rentals because if you have a problem tenant, you can get rid of them like that, overnight. And that is not the case with problem month-to-month renters. They can be really loud, obnoxious, and apparently can ruin neighborhoods. I've never lived on Iron Street. I've never lived, or not for many years, around the college, but I know it can get very annoying, those month-to-month renters. And in my experience, vacation rentals have the most kind and careful guests. And I think that anybody who has used Airbnb probably has experienced that.
About 30 seconds, Peter.
And neighborhood character. I'm concerned about what the last gentleman spoke about in his neighborhood. But I think that student housing, in Bellingham has created a far greater problem than vacation rentals, frankly, with neighborhood character. And then the housing stock issue, I think, is a good one. You're just going to have to wrestle with that. And I think using the infill toolkit, ADUs and such, we have solutions that we really need to employ. So I'm going to follow this and want to be a resource for you. So please reach out to me if you want to hear a perspective from a hotel owner and an Airbnb owner. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Ann?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Ann Mackey. I live in the York neighborhood, and I hope that you received the letter from the York Neighborhood Board that we had sent to Mayor Linville and copied the planning director and the Planning Commission regarding our concern about the timing of this discussion, August 17th. It is prime vacation time for most families. A lot of people are out of town, probably many of the employees in this very building are vacationing. So I think it's been an excellent discussion tonight. I know the expectation is that people who are interested in the topic just ought to watch the recorded broadcast. Well, I think we'd have a much fuller house if this had been scheduled in about a month. But I do thank you. It's been a very interesting conversation. I have a comment about neighborhood associations, Ally, is that the neighborhood associations are basically regulated by the city. We have bylaws. We have to have elections. We receive funding from the city each year for our very existence, and it's kind of like democracy is for people who show up. If you don't show up, I realize you may be busy in raising children, as I was at that age, but we are very inclusive. I think all the neighborhoods work really hard to be very inclusive of all their residents. So I've heard this come up before. We always hear the same speakers. Well, I'm available to come because I'm not on vacation with young kids. But I don't think we should be discounted because you see the same voices. I think we actually do have a democratic process to select people to participate. And I wish we had more, and I'd love to just not have to be here all the time. I have some questions. I think it would be very interesting to ask the question about insurance. Homeowners insurance is one thing. And I know because I owned a rental that my insurance rates changed and I had to remove a wood-burning stove in order to rent it out. And my question is, are these Airbnb places acknowledging to their insurance agency that they're actually running some sort of commercial short-term rental? If I was doing it, I would really want to know, how does my homeowner's insurance cover this? So that'd be a question for planning, maybe to come back and let us know. The question of conditional use permit came up a few times and was referenced as what's being done in other cities. Because I own a commercial business, I'm very familiar. I've been through a CUP process twice. But I think for all of us, and more information for the Planning Commission and the community, is to know, what is that process really all about? What does it entail? How much does it cost the homeowner to do that? And what are the notification processes and public meetings that you're required to hold with your neighbors within 500 feet of your premises? I think it's worth looking at that as a possible element in this whole vacation rental question. If you're on the Planning Commission, you've signed on to be engaged in the process of regulations and codes and planning and protection of our community quality of life. And if that's a surprise to anybody, I don't know, maybe not been paying attention, but in addition to this and ADUs, there are rooming houses. We need to talk about the regulations for that. I would also like to ask the question, what are the regulations for B&Bs? They were very popular at one point in time prior to the internet and all of this new kind of short-term rentals. I've seen homes in our neighborhood where owners have tried to qualify as a bed and breakfast, and they were not allowed by the planning department because they didn't offer enough off-street parking.
About 30 seconds, Ann.
So just to conclude, I think this is a great discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you to the staff for providing all that research. We can't talk about affordable housing in Bellingham without talking about short-term rentals, ADUs, and rooming houses. So this is a good start.
Thank you, Ann. I just want to respond real quick. I don't want you to misconceive my comments from earlier about the neighborhood associations. We deal with the neighborhood associations at all our meetings. I think there's a lot of value to the commentary that the associations bring. I was just responding to what I interpreted Commissioner Crook's comment to be, that we should not engage in this discussion until the neighborhoods tell us whether or not that's what they want to do. And I don't think that's appropriate. But in general, obviously the participation in neighborhoods is critical to that greater discussion. But just there's more than just that. So that's it. But thank you. Okay, is there anybody else who'd like to make a comment at this time? Again, we're going to have another work session. We might have multiple work sessions. We're going to have a public hearing where the focus of the meeting is the public's commentary before we make any decisions or pardon me, any recommendations. So if you go home and wake up in the middle of the night sweating and forgot something that you want to tell us, come to the next meeting or make a written comment as Rick indicated. If nobody else wants to speak, I'm going to close the public comment portion of this. So, so the question from the audience member was about how to address written comment. And yes, if you look up here, the planning@cob.org is the appropriate place to send that. And then they'll kind of weed that out into the appropriate person or location. And then all comments that come in relative to these topics get forwarded on to the Planning Commission email. So we'll receive them all directly as well through our Planning Commission resource email. Thank you, though. Iris.
I just want to encourage folks, too, on the commission and the community in the meantime to use the internet as a resource in understanding what this looks like currently. If you do look at the map on the Airbnb website of rentals in Bellingham, they're actually very dispersed. I see rentals on Maplewood, I see rentals along Chuckanut Drive, and actually the place where you see the least, which makes sense, is in the area of Western and South Hill, where so many houses are either owned by long-term owners or are currently being rented by students. And so I think it's an interesting thing to look at. And then another thing that, just a quick fact that I found interesting, currently there are 350 units in Bellingham available, and in Port Townsend population, I think around 10,000. there are 259 units currently available in Port Townsend on Airbnb. So I would say probably a lack of regulation or not allowing it may not be doing it.
That's an interesting observation. Lisa?
I do want to cycle back to a request, and it's because we skipped over the first page, whether or not it would be unregulated, conditional, or allowed. And since we didn't really discuss that, Anne triggered a memory of a note I had written. There's some benefits for the conditional allowed, and that would be the permitted process. I'd like to know if we went that direction, what some of the barriers would be, what the costs would be for the applicants. And those would be concerns a little bit if it was just very cost prohibitive, because I do think we need to come up with something that brings us into the light and not have a situation where it's not permitted and you still have 200 and some there. But I'd also like to know if there is somewhere within the regulation, if we didn't do conditional allowed, where there would be a notification requirement to a certain area within the neighborhood, because I would personally like to know who has one, so I know when there's going to be temporary guests, and that I would know that I could get posted of who to contact and such. And if there's not some kind of notification to the nearby neighbors, people may not be aware of some of those resources that would be available to them. So if we didn't do conditional, where could we put a notification requirement within somewhere in the regulations and have it fit?
Good observation. So we'll have more discussion about this. Is there anything else on this particular topic tonight? Steve?
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment. First of all, I'd like to thank Jane, Carrie, Carter, Peter, and Ann. Your comments were as diverse as our comments were tonight, and we welcome that kind of input. Thank you for coming down. I'd like to thank the director and Lisa. This is quite a lot of information and a lot of work, and I recognize that. And you might wonder why I make some of the comments I do. I am currently president of a homeowners association with 228 homes. We can't stop the renters. That's the problem. They are out of control. We're doing everything we can. And I speak from a voice of experience. I want to try to make our neighborhood as nice as every neighborhood in this city, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of enforcement, and those are my concerns, to see a program getting going and knowing the time that you're going to have to spend on it. And those are concerns as a person that pays taxes. So just so you know, that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, well, again, I thought that was a good discussion, and I can't remember who in the public said that, we had a very varied thoughts on it, so that's good. I'm actually looking forward to getting the full body, because I know that Phyllis and Garrett will also probably have different opinions than the rest of us about it. And so we're going to do that at some point in the future. With that, I'll close the work session, but the only other thing we need to talk about is our next scheduled meeting, which is September 7th, which is, as Rick indicated, a work session on the consideration of the proposed changes to the AD ordinance. So we'll probably hear that. That's our next meeting. We'll hear that, and Lisa, I think that tracks with the point you were making, which is really good. How do we reconcile those two? And then after that, I'm assuming we'll circle back to another meeting on this at some point in the fall, maybe?
The strategy here is that we can alternate these bodies of work, because it takes so much time after one meeting to respond to the issues. We can't turn it around in 2 weeks.
Sure.
So we could bring the second subject up and keep us moving forward and tracking on both.
Thank you. So anyone interested in this will probably be interested in ADUs. September 7th, we're going to have a work session. It may be a similar format, but of course we'll have public comment on that. Typically our staff reports are issued at least a week in advance, so you can get those online. And we look forward to more participation and more opinions on this. I know I am. I'm excited to get into this more. So thank you, everybody. And with that, we will adjourn.